This week on the Deep Seed podcast, I met with Willemijn De Jongh from Commonland. We talk about large-scale ecosystem restoration projects with a particular focus on examples from the Netherlands and from Spain. We also discuss where the opposition between nature and agriculture comes from and solutions to change that. Another topic we cover, which I think is really interesting, is the human versus wildlife conflicts, such as the issue with the wolves coming back to Europe right now. And on the one hand, the amazing benefits to ecosystems they bring, but also the dilemmas it poses for humans. This episode was made in partnership with Soil Capital. I am your host, Raphael, and this is the Deep Seed podcast. Hi, Willemijn.
Hi, hello.
Thank you so much for welcoming me into your home. Here we're in Wageningen.
Super nice to have you. Yeah, it's nice to open up the house for you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. If you're listening to this, there's also a video version available online, so go check it out. And I'm super happy to finally meet you because a lot of my previous guests on the podcast have mentioned Commonland and they've mentioned you. And I've been dying to learn more about what you're doing. So I'm really happy to be here.
Wow, that's lovely to hear.
And maybe you could start by introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about your personal journey and what led you to a path of being part of the ecosystem restoration movement.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to. So actually, I grew up in this house, which you're in. So I know this house by heart. I know every little corner and of this place. And I think that also connects to the bigger work that I'm doing, which is really connecting to a place. So I've grown up here. It was a kind of an international home, even though it was in a small university town in the Netherlands called Wageningen. Some people might know it from Wageningen University. So growing up here, it's a small town place, but the window has always been open to the rest of the world. A lot of international students, teachers, researchers. And so my mom also worked in development cooperation. My father worked in large mammal conservation, so lion conservation. So I've met a lot of people from all over the world growing up. And I realized, oh, wow, there's a lot of different ways in which you can look at the world. There's not just one truth, which was the truth that I was living, in a Dutch town. So that shaped me greatly. And fast forward, after high school, I left Wageningen and studied anthropology, which also brought me to different places around the world, research in Kenya on human-wildlife conflicts, research in South Africa on fishing rights and access to fishing rights, and also researching land rights issues. So I was always interested in how do we organize ourselves in such a way that we can live in a place, in a healthy place, but also manage what in studies it was called natural resource management. It's a bit of a dry word for actually saying how do we organize our environmental resources in such a way that we can live from it, but that it also can regenerate itself. Not overfishing, not over using the land, stuff like that. So I was always interested in finding that balance. And then after a small detour, I started in international cooperation, also having been grown up in that place with my mom working there and my father as well. So I did that for a couple of years, which was mostly, it was at Oxfam Novib around policy influencing. So trying to encourage large banks, food and beverage companies to increase their efforts for more sustainable practices. So we were kind of creating scorecards where you can see how your bank scores on how they invest, or how your company scores on how they treat women in their supply chain, for example. So I was always interested in how do we shift the system. But at some point I noticed that I was trying to change a system or optimize a system to do less harm. And then I was like, oh, what am I doing? I want to create something else. And then I bumped into Commonland through the movie. It's called Green Gold. You've probably heard it before. I don't know. It's online as well on YouTube. It's called Green Gold. It's made by John Liu, the famous documentary maker. And it changed my life, actually. I saw the episode on the work that's been done in the Loess Plateau in China, the size of Belgium, actually, the region. And they've managed to regenerate the region in 20 years' time through funding of the World Bank, amongst other. And the region is like, it's lush and green, and soil health is improved, and also the social benefits can be seen there. Of course, it's an example from a country that's maybe different from European countries. So Commonland, the organization, was interested in exploring how can we approach a large-scale landscape restoration in a way that's holistic, so that it integrates multiple things and can be also community-led. And that's how Commonland kind of came to be. So when I saw that documentary and also saw Commonland featured in it, and I was walking around with this feeling like, I want to create an alternative. I want to contribute to building a new cathedral rather than trying to optimize an old one. One thing led to another. There was a vacancy. I applied almost 8 years ago. And since then, I've been with the Commonland team trying to support holistic landscape restoration.
I see. Yeah, a lot of the sort of sustainability movement that's been around for a long time is about doing a little bit less bad.
Yeah.
But some other movements, like the restoration and regeneration movements, are more about how can we do better? Like how can we improve life on Earth, right?
And then realizing that you can... Sometimes we see ourselves as a human species as kind of invasive, and we're bad and we have a negative impact. And if only us humans would go out of the picture, then nature can thrive. You know, that's kind of the image that we get from media and from just the way we talk about it. Also in the climate change discussion, it's very negative. You know, we need to fly less, eat less, be less. It's almost like you can't be there. And even though it's important to address our negative impact and be very conscious of it, I think it's way more attractive to also think about it more in a, how can we find our place again in the bigger whole of life, you know, in the bigger chain of events. And I think we can actually play a positive role where we can connect to our community, we can connect to ourselves, we can connect to our environment, and actually create beautiful things, healthy products from healthy soils, a healthy job doing something that matters in connection to the community you're living in, kind of a positive perspective on what it means to be a human, right. Rather than, I need to be less, and I need to, if, you know, I'm a bad person because I eat and I sleep and I go on holidays. But to rethink that, like, who are we as humans, and how can we restructure society in such a way that we're a positive influence?
That's great. I love that. It's really something that I struggle with when I talk about these subjects with friends and family, and I'm trying to make them aware of the actual situation. It's hard sometimes not to be too negative because there's a lot of negative facts to share. And I feel like I'm sometimes doing more harm than good by sharing that perspective. I'm trying to find new perspectives to share and focus on the positives that we can do as humans, right? So I probably have a lot to learn from you at this stage. But
well, it helps that I'm like a born optimist. So I've always been quite optimistic. Sometimes in the past it was mistaken by being naive, but I'm starting to realize it's actually not. I'm like a realistic optimist. So of course I'm aware of where things can go wrong. Also, even now in the world, there's a lot of darkness. So it's not trying to downplay that, but to organize our systems, societal systems, in such a way that we allow more light to get in, people to connect, and to have a healthy economy within a certain optimum of what society can carry, what the environment can carry, but that can also have a sustainable business model for a farmer.
Offer a positive perspective for people, a story that people can get behind.
An alternative, maybe. Yeah. Maybe that's the word, an alternative.
Because if you only hear bad news, but you don't have a solution to go towards, or a vision of a future that is desirable for you, then you just get depressed about it, or you just completely deny the information.
Yeah, and I think in the polarized society that we're living in, I think what kind of on the right side of the political spectrum, what they've done right is listen to those feelings of discomfort and increasing inequality. And even though it's not nice to listen to populists, what they do well is like sense into what's real for people and then address that. But instead of providing a positive alternative, they're pointing at all the negativity and everything that's wrong. And I think to the center-left side of the political spectrum, we could have built a more positive alternative rather than, well, climate change is coming and we need to do less and we need to be less. That's not really a very attractive future to run towards, you know?
True, yeah. And focus more on the more. It could be more. It could be more beauty, more biodiversity, more free time, more connection with your community. But that story is much more complicated to explain. It's very nuanced. It's complex, and it takes a lot of time to explain how that's possible.
Yeah.
Rather than the alternative, which is just pointing a finger at someone who's responsible for your problems. That's such a much easier story to tell and for people to get behind, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. And I think what Commonland has tried to do, and what I hope we contribute to this field, is to come up with kind of a language that is accessible, easy to understand. So it's not like investor language, but it's also not deep farmer language that also some people don't understand. So it's kind of a middle ground where we try to think about society in terms of also the losses and returns. So that's kind of a economical language that a lot of people understand. So if you look at land degradation and the way we use land too intensively, and also our seas, it leads to a lot of losses. So you get a loss of natural values, so biodiversity, water health, soil health, that goes down. You have a loss of social values, so communities disintegrating, loss of jobs, loss of economic activity. You have a loss of financial values, so the loss of economic activity also connects there, and less investment. So in some regions, for example, there's more desertification, or soil health is really going down. You see this happening, this kind of spiral with multiple losses. And in the end, it also leads to a loss of hope and inspiration. Like, why am I here? People moving out of regions, or people moving to the cities. So we see this global trend. And what if we can turn these losses into full returns? In the Netherlands, we also sometimes call them values. You can actually turn it around by actively looking at those four things consistently. You can start to build kind of we call it holistic approach, to look at society in a more integrated way. Not just look at financial capital, not just look at natural capital, but really looking at the whole. Like, how can we create activities that tick multiple boxes? So, for example, Willemijn, the one that you're going to speak to him tomorrow, which is really nice. Willemijn is a business that's been set up actually by a former Commonlander. That's really nice. And they're ticking a lot of boxes. So they're working with farmers that are trying to find alternative incomes next to their main income. They're planting native species for production of tea, amongst other products. And they're letting half of the plants rest from the land for biodiversity purposes, so for insects and birds, and the other half they use for production of selling like highly biodiverse, nice teas, for example. And so it's nice that they're ticking multiple boxes. So it's socially valuable for the farmers, for the consumers that are really attracted to this idea of contributing. It's a financial value because they're a healthy business starting to grow. It creates a lot of hope and inspiration that you can actually buy a product, and the more tea you drink, the more biodiversity comes back. And natural capital, of course, because the native plants are there and some part of them stay. And then there's a lot of insects and animals profiting from that or benefiting.
Right. So these four returns, that's something I wanted to speak about maybe a bit later in the conversation. But since we're here, let's talk about it, right?
Okay, cool.
I learned about it first from Caroline from Kelp Blue that was on the podcast recently. And she mentioned these four returns and how they as a business are using this framework.
Wow.
For their business. So you said, so you're looking at four different types of
Correct.
returns. So one is economic, one is social,
yeah.
One is inspiration,
yeah,
and the last one is nature.
Natural, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Awesome. How do you do that? What does it mean? How do you measure these returns, and how did this model work?
So we call it a four returns framework, but it's actually also just a way of thinking. So the way we've approached it, so the model was developed by our founder to kind of bridge the gap between the language that investors use versus maybe the language that a farmer might use. And what we see often is that we're lost in translation. And part of the polarization is also because we just don't understand each other. There's so many different bubbles that you can be in where a certain language makes a lot of sense to you. But if you then talk to someone else that's active in that, living in that same landscape, but doing a different thing or having a different profession, you can't really understand each other. And so he went on this journey to figure out, is there kind of a common language that we can develop that can bridge these gaps? Because in the end, in a landscape, everything comes together. And you have farmers, you have consumers, you have businesses, you have governments. Everybody needs to live together there. But how do you understand each other, and how do you create a shared future together and an alternative future for a place? So the model is meant to be like a language bridge, kind of. And so the way we've applied it is through partners, basically. Partners that have already been working holistically or adopted the model and started to work holistically. So they are actually testing it on the ground. So they're working in regions in Spain, the Netherlands, Australia, South Africa, India, all over the place. Local organizations rooted in a place, they live and work there. And they totally resonate with this idea of working in an integrated way, not just looking at one thing, but looking at the whole and constantly keeping an eye on the whole. Of course, you have very concrete interventions. So you work with farmers, and to move to more regenerative forms of farming, you work with local citizens and consumers to help them become more aware of their place, to work with local artists to create kind of an imagined future, to work with local businesses that can help create a healthy business model.
But I'm trying to understand this sort of full return model, but what it means really for, maybe you have an example of a project or a company you work with that's implementing these full returns, and sort of use that example to explain.
Yeah. So the closest example to me, to what I've worked most with, is in the Netherlands. So in 2016, Commonland was asked to also explore this holistic approach in the Netherlands. How can you regenerate a region or a landscape based on this holistic full returns approach? And then after a whole mapping exercise and looking around, we landed in the Western Peat Meadow landscape. So that's between Utrecht and Amsterdam, so to the west of the Netherlands, a very highly populated area. Millions of people live there. And quite soon after we landed there and started to test the ground, it also turned into an independent organization. It's called Wij.Land. So they're one of our key partners now. They're an independent organization with their own mission and vision, but it's really built on the same DNA of this idea of the four returns approach. So what they did to start out with is just to sense into the landscape. Who's living here? Who's farming here? What are their dreams and hopes? What are their worries and challenges? So they spend a lot of time listening to the stories of farmers in the region. And the reason why they chose farmers is because 70% of the land in that region is managed or owned by farmers. So if you want to transition the land use on such a large scale, we're talking about 250,000 hectares. It's almost, maybe 1/5 of the Netherlands, you could say. That's a huge scale. So if you want to change the land use system, you need to work with the people that have access to land and can manage it differently. So they started with 5 farmers a couple of years ago, 5-6 years ago, and now they're working with 300 farmers in the region. So they started listening, they started experimenting, piloting. Can we do things differently? It's dominated by intensive dairy farming. Can that be more extensive? Can we move from monoculture ryegrass to maybe herb-rich grasslands? How can we try that out on 1 hectare, maybe 2 hectares? So, and the more farmers joined, the more the farmer learning network started to emerge. Of course, they also worked with festivals, citizen activities involving communities. Also looking at the business model of farmers. Can we create alternative forms of income so that you can change from a highly intensive one product based farm to a more diverse farm? And what you're seeing is that because they're so highly practical and rooted in the place and listening to the people that live there, this is also starting to attract attention from municipalities, the water boards, the provincial government, the national government, because they have such rich knowledge and insight into what farmers want and need, that it's really grown to be a strong organization with really strong evidence that regenerative farming, or nature-inclusive farming, as we call it in the Netherlands, makes a lot of sense. And actually, if you ask an average farmer in the Netherlands, I think most of them would say, I want a transition, I want to change, except the rules are not clear, the rules are constantly changing. Plus, you need this transition period of at least 5 years to be able to switch from a highly intensive, high capital model to an extensive, more diverse model. So that's, I think, a really nice example of where they've worked a lot on the social values and creating hope and inspiration by just trying out things. And then looking at the business model of the farmers and trying to see if there are alternatives possible. So that's the financial capital as well. And of course, how can we bring back meadow birds? Can we bring back the herb-rich grasslands? And because it used to actually, a lot of ecology in that area kind of co-evolved with the way we were farming more extensively. So a lot of the meadow birds are there because of the way of farming, at least a couple of decades ago, and we're trying to bring that back. So I think it's a nice story of how it all comes together. Yeah.
So if I understand the story here, like you identified a project, a region where something could be done.
Yeah.
And then started small with this partner to identify some farmers who might be willing to take part of a sort of a pilot at first.
Yeah.
And then this is kind of growing more and more. And the idea is to try and get the whole region, which is a massive region, 250,000 hectares, you said, right?
Yeah.
To be part of this restoration project.
Yeah.
Right?
So, and our role vis-a-vis this partner is then to support them to be able to, for them to be a free player, kind of, or be a convening power in the region. So we're supporting them with free and flexible process funding. Well, it's free as in unallocated, so unrestricted, so they can actually use that funding for their time to be able to play into whatever opportunities arise. What you often see is that we work in a kind of a project-based society where we have a lot of projects with 2-year funding, 3-year funding, maybe 5-year funding if you're lucky. But the commitment to the longer-term regeneration of a region is not so long. And we work with the 20-year timeline minimum, so 1 generation, because we believe if you want to restore a place, it takes at least a generation to get moving and get into action and actually create change, rather than a 2-3 year project where you're trying to change a system that's been evolved, evolved over decades. So our role vis-a-vis this partner Wij.Land, for example, is to support them in being able to tune into the landscape and respond effectively and go where the energy is. And so also, strategic support, cheerleading them, providing the unrestricted funding, and also showing that it's like you need a base level of funding to be able to create this type of system change instead of the project-to-project type funding. So we're also influencing funders, donors, investors to start to fund differently, with more patience, maybe with a lower return on investment, but multiple values that you create. So how can you create full returns with one type of funding? And that you need longer term funding, more trust-based. So that's kind of our role, to create this space for others to be able to play that role.
Okay, yeah.
So they're in the lead, basically.
Let me just take a really short break from this conversation to tell you about the official partner of this podcast, Soil Capital. Soil Capital is a company that accelerates the transition to regenerative agriculture by financially rewarding farmers who improve the health of their soils. It's a company that I personally really like. I'm a big fan of their work, and I'm really proud to be partnering with them for the podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Soil Capital, I will leave a link in the description of this episode. Let's get back to the conversation. We skipped a really important step that we really need to rewind and talk about Commonland.
Good one. Yeah, let's
we
start
need to explain
there.
what is Commonland, what is the story behind Commonland, and what actually, what is Commonland?
Yeah, what is Commonland? Good question. I think a lot of people wonder what Commonland is because we play such a very different roles. So sometimes we're the funder, sometimes we're an enabler, sometimes we're a catalyst, sometimes we're mostly a supporter or an enthusiast. So I think what we're increasingly trying to do is enable others to be able to play this convening role in a landscape. Can be one partner, can be multiple partners. But in the end, we want to create like an ecosystem of organizations, can be for-profit and not-for-profit in the mix, that can take care of a large space, a landscape in this case, and regenerate it over time. And we're trying to connect dots and make that possible through providing learning opportunities, knowledge exchange opportunities across landscapes. So, for example, we have also a collaboration with Ashoka, the Netherlands, the Ashoka network. It's called Bioregional Weaving Labs, which is a European-wide network of maybe, approximately 10 different landscapes in Europe, all characterized by local organizations living and working in that place, trying to help regenerate it with farmers, with people living there, with businesses. And they're all trying to do that at a landscape level. Of course, you start small, farm by farm, and creating a farmer network. But in the end, you're always looking at the bigger whole, like how will this affect the ecology or the water catchment over time? And I think it's basically how we should live. And I think Commonland is trying to make that possible, both at the system level, so talking to system players like banks and investors, sometimes also government in support of our local partners, but also through direct support in landscapes. And I think the past decade was characterized by a lot of direct landscape development support. So how can we support partners on the ground to help regenerate their place and make that possible in all kinds of ways? And I think the coming decade for us will be also trying to create spaces for these landscapes that are emerging all over the world. We're not the only ones stimulating this. So there's an amazing movement emerging for all these landscapes to exchange with each other, and for all the leaders there. There's so many leaders in this field to be able to learn from each other, but also develop their own leadership skills. You need a very particular type of leadership to be able to work at the system level, because you can't work with quick fixes and quick solutions. You need to look at the whole constantly. And so that's also why we like to work a lot with Theory U. It's an approach developed at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, MIT. And it's built on the idea that if you work on yourself, on your inner condition as a human being, that will also benefit the quality of whatever you do outside. And I mean, a lot of us, we know about personal development and leadership skills, and some of us might have done some work on that as well. And you notice it when someone's worked on him or herself, and you also notice it when someone hasn't. When you meet someone that knows his or her blind spots, you can immediately sense it. It creates a kind of quality of presence, a quality of action. So we're also trying to stimulate kind of landscape leadership skills for people to be able to work in these complex fields. Can you imagine a large landscape where you can drive for 2-3 hours? How do you work on that level? Yeah. And what is needed to be able to oversee that and make decisions and make connections and mobilize funding, mobilize people?
It sounds extremely complex.
Yeah.
Just the definition here of what you do with Commonland, it required a 5-minute sort of explanation.
Yes,
But if I understand this correctly, right? Your goal is to enable people and organizations and stakeholders in different landscapes to undertake regeneration projects, restoration projects.
So we're trying to stimulate the uptake of holistic landscape restoration. That's like in one sentence.
Okay. And you do that through a lot of different tools, methods, by connecting people, by providing knowledge, by providing funding.
Yeah.
You talked about earlier, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is the picture becoming clearer?
It is.
Okay.
It is.
Okay.
I'm trying to sort of, unpick the details and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
So that if we talk about the funding aspect of it, where does this funding come from?
Good question. So when our journey started, our founder spent a lot of time to look for funders that have the patience to understand that this takes 20 years. There were also some doors that he closed, like consciously, because he felt like if they can't commit to at least the intention of sticking around, then why would we have this conversation? Because he was the former director of IUCN in the Netherlands. This is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, a great network of talented people working on nature restoration, conservation. And what he noticed is that there were so many efforts to restore landscapes, to regenerate a place, and they were all based on, short-term project cycles. So when the funding runs out, there's a lot of projects that also dry up and then end. And he was so tired of this short cycle projects that trying to create like long-term cycle change. And so when he founded Commonland, one of his intentions was to also look for financial partners, funding partners that understand this. And interestingly, we've landed a lot with family offices and philanthropists because they're often family based, wealthy families, for example, and they get this intergenerational thinking, which is super interesting because they understand that what I do is connected to what my forefathers did and what my children or family will do from here on. So this idea of it's not about me in the now, it's about everything that came before me and everything that will come after me. That was an interesting connection. So our funding comes from Commonland Foundation, but also other family funds that really understand this sort of long-term journey and intergenerational thinking. We've also found allies in other funds like the IKEA Foundation, the National Postcode Lottery. They're really, they understand that you need to be patient. And they understand that creating systemic change in society takes time. And we're really happy to see more and more funders getting on this path, including investors. We just need to slow down a little bit.
Yeah, you found these investors who understand that it takes a long time to achieve this restorations, but also that is okay with the concept of separating the returns and not focusing only on the financial returns and knowing that some of that investment is going to be social returns and environmental returns. And not just financial, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also just a sense of purpose. You can have all the money in the world, but let's be honest, in the end, we're all, going to another world at some point in this life. We're not going to be here. And what do you want to leave behind then? A lot of money? Or do you want to create change? And so why are we actually here on Earth? It's also about that question. And also investors and people working in a bank, they are also human beings that want to make a change. And so speaking also to the heart of why am I here and what does it mean to be human and how can I contribute the best way I can while having a healthy financial return, of course. But what is healthy? And that's a good discussion to have. And what is reasonable? Is there like an economic optimum that we can identify as a society within which we can operate? I think the donut model by Kate Raworth is a good example that we're really inspired by, because you have this social foundation and an environmental ceiling, and within that there's a safe operating space for humanity. So that's why it's called the donut. And I look at society and the economy in that way. Like, how can we find this optimum so that we can eat and live now and have our lives and live our lives, but also give to the future and make sure future generations have a place.
Right. It's about trying to find this middle ground between using enough resources and energy and so that we can live comfortably and happily in our society, but not so much so that we destroy and deplete and degrade our world.
And I think interestingly in Corona times, a lot of us thought like, oh yeah, this is the time where we can like do things differently. And after Corona, we're going to do things differently. We're going to find this optimum and we're going to be like scaled down a little bit. But I think we're back to where we were in a way. But I do feel like something has changed. I think more and more people are starting to realize, hey, where am I? Where do I actually live? And where are local products coming from? And how can I buy more local. So maybe it's my own bubble, perhaps. But I do feel like the Corona did change our perspective a little bit on how reliant we are on these international trade systems and how not reliable we are in our own self-sufficiency or self-governing mechanism. So I feel like this localizing our economy a little bit more, that has gained ground, while of course staying connected to a global system. We can't disconnect. It's always been connected, but it needs to be in balance, the global and the local.
I'd love to hear some more stories.
Yes, please. Good.
Of, feel-good stories of ecosystem restoration, some of your favorite ones from Commonland.
Yes. Okay, let's grab some popcorn. My favorite ones. So I just told you about Wij.Land in the Western Peat Meadow landscapes. I've had the pleasure to work with them for the past 3 years, and I think they're such an amazing team. And what I like is that in the midst of intensifying polarization in the Netherlands between the farming community and almost like the rest of the Netherlands, a lot of people misunderstand, I think, farmers. They were, kind of after the Second World War, encouraged to create a lot of high production food so that we weren't going to be hungry anymore. And that started actually before the Second World War even, but that's too long of a story for now. And what I even though the polarization intensified, what I like about the work of Wij.Land is that because they're such a neutral convener in the landscape, they've managed to stay in touch with the farming community. And even though farmers are desperate and struggling to find ways forward with this, like changing policies and commitments and goals and targets also at the EU level, they've managed to keep the community warm and connected. And people can also express their desperation. And that's so inspiring to see that they still have a home in that network to go to, even though tensions might be rising. So I thought that was really amazing to observe. And in Spain, it's an amazing example. It's even a 1 million hectare landscape with our partner Alvalal. And they've been active since 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And they also work with young education of young kids and trying to connect them to a place. They also work with life-size art pieces in the landscape where you stand on a hill and can see like an 8,000-year-old cave drawing kind of mirrored in lavender plantings in the landscapes. In Peru, you have these famous earth drawings of the spider and the monkey and like these ancient drawings on the land. They have a name that I've lost now. But they've tried, it's a similar type, kind of like a massive inspirational project to show the history of the place, the deep history of the place. Those cave drawings are 8,000 years old, and they can now be seen in the landscape with these changing native plants that are flowering, including lavender.
Right, so they've recreated these cave paintings
on the land,
on the fields full of different plants and flowers and lavender,
exactly,
to try and recreate them.
It's called Alvalal 8000. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah,
but they're also working with hundreds of farmers in the region, mostly rain-fed almond production, trying to help. To make it less, so to bring down the tilling, to regenerate soil health, to bring back ground cover, to also bring back this kind of integrated system that actually has been popular in the Iberian Peninsula, in Portugal and Spain for decades, where you have this dehesa system, where it's both ground cover, pollination, like pollinator plants for honey production, for example. You have local sheep species grazing throughout the orchards, and you can have almond production from the almonds, both in terms of oil, but also the nuts or almond butter. So there's this integrated system that they're trying to reintroduce or make people get farmers excited about.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Alfonso from La Junquera.
Cool. Yeah.
And so many of my conversations on the podcast go back to him. He's very connected to so many regeneration projects. It's amazing. So if anyone wants to learn more about this amazing restoration project in Spain, like go and listen to my conversation with Alfonso.
Good one. Yeah, Alfonso is amazing, and his wife Yannick. They've managed. It was nice because talking about stories. I remember meeting Yannick. She was still doing her research at Commonland as an intern, and she went to Spain to do her research. She met Alfonso there. They fell in love, and now they're together. They got married. They're a family, and they're trying to regenerate his family farm together. And they've managed to create such an amazing community of local people getting involved, volunteers dropping in, doing research, learning a lot about regenerative farming. So it's like a massive hub in the landscape. Also, the first ecosystem restoration community started there. It's so nice to observe how she was doing research there, and now she's like a super farmer doing amazing things with Alfonso. And I follow their journey with a lot of joy.
What a beautiful story, right?
Yeah.
Love at the center of it, and so much has been flourishing since.
Yeah.
Incredible. And you mentioned Alvelal earlier, so that's kind of a regional organization that they formed together with lots of other farmers in the region, right?
Exactly.
To look at the So that's maybe a great example to talk about the concept of landscape scale regeneration, and how does that work? What is a landscape scale regeneration? I mean, maybe it's in the title, but you can tell us more about it. And how do you make that happen with so many different people, organizations, stakeholders involved?
So first of all, the question is what defines a landscape, really? And in some cases, it's really obvious. You have like ecological boundaries, like a water catchment. For people that are familiar with geology and ecology, can really identify that on the map quite easily. So you have geological boundaries, ecological boundaries that can define it, but it could also be a cultural or a social boundary. For example, a certain community definition, but it could also be a jurisdictional boundary, just plain a certain province or a district, for example. And we're not very dogmatic in what it is or isn't, but we know when it is a landscape and we know when it's not. So it's also a lot to do with how people perceive the area. Sometimes there's a lot of awareness about a certain region or bioregion or landscape being a bioregion or landscape. I've heard from friends, I've never traveled to Latin America, but I've heard from friends that have worked there that bioregional thinking is very common in a lot of Latin American countries, also because of the fact that there are mountains and like valleys that almost automatically create kind of a boundary that's just shaped by mountains, and the way water flows in it, and the way you can use land in it, and the way the community identifies itself versus maybe the community on the other side of the mountain. So in some countries, it's quite common to see yourself as part of a bioregional landscape. In some countries, we've lost it a little bit. I would say in Western Europe, I feel that's the region I know best. I feel like our connection to place has been degrading a little bit. So we're trying to rejuvenate that. And actually the region I live in now, I'm born and raised, is the South Veluwe watershed in the Netherlands. There's also an initiative that popped up here. It was actually my dream once to be like, oh, what if I could do this work in my own region? And then I bumped into two people, Eduardo and Janneke, and they wanted to work on rooting deeper in this place that we live here in South Veluwe. That was a year and a half ago. So now we're also working with them on, helping to regenerate this region here that I live in here. So we're now trying to mobilize the community, work with front-runner farmers, but also farmers that are wanting to take some first steps. They have this agroecological cooperative called Streekwaar, where there are like 40 local agroecological producers already mobilized and organized. You can sell their produce in the weekly market. But we were also thinking, what if you can create more awareness about what this landscape is and what it has to offer, but also where it's healthy and where it's not, and how can we work together to help regenerate that, including with the municipality and more governmental actors, including businesses. I think the elements that you always put in the landscape restoration soup are community mobilization, farmer mobilization, creating learning networks, looking at local businesses and supporting them to scale up or try out new things, trying to mobilize funding for the right things, involve as many stakeholders as possible to look at the puzzle together. I think there are a couple of ingredients that you see across these landscapes that come back and again and again.
Mm-hmm. I guess there's the need also for the awareness from people within that bioregion or that landscape to understand that they're part of it. People love to be proud of where they're from, their region, their country, their city, but they're not aware that they're part of a bioregion, right? We never hear about that. Yeah. So it's hard to care about protecting it and making it more beautiful and more, more regenerated if you don't even know that you're part of it, right?
Yeah.
So I guess maybe that's one aspect of it, is getting people, including the farmers and the people who work that land, to realize they're actually part of it.
Yeah, so it's about starting a conversation about where are we living and how do you look at this place, and asking a lot of questions, listening a lot to people living in the area. How do they experience living in here? What did they like about living here? Where did they see challenges and opportunities? And how was it to live here maybe 10, 20 years ago? And how has it changed for the better or for the worse? And so that you need to do a lot of listening, a lot of sensing. We use the word sensing into the landscape to get a sense of, is there a kind of a shared sense of place or a place of belonging or not? And if not, how can we stimulate that or spark that? And it starts with gathering stories from the region, listening to the stories. So, for example, in this region, we had an event in one of a very special market garden, like organic biodynamic gardens, not too far from here. They produce food, and there was a couple of people invited to tell their story in groups, like a person, like a newcomer that moved here with her family, fleeing from war, and she started a local business with catering, and she's hiring a lot of refugee women to help in her business to grow the food. I was also invited to share my story, being like born and raised here, and then working internationally on landscape restoration, and then being able to like do this also in my own home. There was also a person who works a lot with local grains and creating beer and bread from like ancient old species of grain. So there's all these stories, and once you start to gather these stories, a common shared image starts to emerge, and you can then start to identify some activities that you can do together and just get going with maybe some funding that you might have.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd love to come back to the first example you gave here about here in the Netherlands. Is it Wij.Land?
Wij.Land, yeah.
Wij.Land, because, well, this podcast, the central topic of the podcast is regenerative agriculture, or the question of how do we keep producing food to feed humanity, but without degrading our ecosystems, but instead regenerating them. So you mentioned that a big part of that project was to work with farmers, right? Because most of that land is farmers. And there's sometimes a lot of opposition between nature and farming in debates or in the media. And I was wondering first, what do you think about that opposition?
Yeah, it's staggering how we've managed to pull them apart, even though they're so connected. And even in the Dutch context, we have policies disconnecting them. So we have kind of bestemmingsplannen. I don't know how to translate this. So we have rules for what you can use land for, and they're written by law, and you need to prove that you're going to use it for either nature, then it has lower value than if you use it for production, then it has a higher value. And these plots of land are extremely expensive in the Netherlands, which is also a big problem holding us back from moving to a more sustainable form of agriculture, because farmers simply don't have access to land because it's too expensive. But it's interesting how we've kind of separated them apart, also like by law and through rules and regulations. And the two shall also never meet. But interestingly, farming is actually, in a way, it's you're farming nature. You're working with nature to grow things. Grass doesn't grow because we want it to. It grows because it's a natural rhythm, And so in our model, we haven't talked about it yet, but we also have a thing called the 3 zones. It's kind of a way of looking at the landscape. So in general, you could say there's a natural zone, which is often like a forested area or a natural area that a lot of people know. You have an economic zone, which is mostly dominated by monoculture farming nowadays, very intensive, very high production oriented. I think this intensive agricultural model is seen all over the world. It's either nature or production. And we're trying to introduce this third zone, which we call the combined zone, just trying to open up our thinking around, oh, wait a minute, you can also combine the two, like agroforestry systems, silvopasture systems, regenerative agriculture forms. So this is where you work with nature and trying to like move with nature rather than against it. And what if we increase that combined zone and decrease the economic zone of monoculture and let the economic zone be mostly a zone of infrastructure, living, and stuff like that, rather than this monoculture landscape with just one crop and zero biodiversity or limited biodiversity. So this combined zone is a way to open up our thinking from nature or production to, hey, what if you combine it and actually have this kind of resilient, vibrant, thriving zone of production as well as a lot of natural values?
Right. So the story is not to say we need to transition productive farmland to natural ecosystems, but just to maybe open up that third type of zone. So some of that productive land becomes mixed land, but that is still highly productive, but that includes a lot of nature, like agroforestry and things like that.
And maybe
right?
it's less productive, but that's okay because a lot of other values are created. And if you combine it with kind of regionalization of our food system and redistributing our food equally, because there's actually a lot of food produced in the world, there's also a problem around distribution and fair sharing of the food all over the world, which is hampering our food food security. So it's not necessarily a question of are we producing enough? The question is, are we organizing our food economies smartly in such a way that we can have a balance between local production and consumption versus global trade system, which is characterized a lot by bulk production and moving of like bulk production to often one type of crop, maize, sugar. So we need to rethink our whole food system. So if you combine like a lower focus on yields with a more balanced system, you can actually start to create balanced local food systems that are more healthy.
And you were saying earlier that you have the two zones legally, and one is worth much more than the other. So the farmland, productive land, is worth more than forest land, for example. Is that still the case legally? And is that still the case factually, that those natural ecosystems, that land is worth less?
In the Netherlands, for sure.
Yeah.
And also on the natural zone, there's one thing I want to say. So of course we need to create more ecological corridors and create more space for nature. Next to increasing this combined zone, definitely also rewilding or creating more space for nature to do what it does best, but also opening it up for people to enjoy it rather than putting a fence around it and shutting it off. We're also really a big fan of like opening up nature, but also creating more space. So this question around agricultural land being of higher value because it creates higher economic value compared to natural zones in the Netherlands is definitely still the case.
And so that third zone you're trying to create, is that something that you're hoping will become a legal thing as well? That there will be seen officially as a type of zone that could potentially retain the value of that farmland, but bring in more nature?
Actually, in the Netherlands, there's also a lot of organizations trying to plea for this combined zone. We call it landscape zone, but politically, that concept hasn't been taken up as much as we would like to. I do understand that now in the Netherlands, there's also a crop code for food forests. So you can actually have a plot of land that can formally get a food forest code. So you're then allowed to have like high biodiverse use of the land while creating healthy products. Yeah. So it is shifting, but way too slowly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
At least I'm speaking mostly for the Netherlands, the Dutch context.
It's good to have it.
But I think with EU regulations and the common agricultural policy in Europe, a lot of these issues around like these boxes that we've created for this is nature, this is production land. I wouldn't be surprised if it's all over Europe. I've heard about it in Spain as well. So this is definitely a problem all over that we box things in.
So is that one of the reasons a lot of the time farmers seems to be quite against the idea of rewilding or transferring productive agricultural land to be regenerated in a completely wild way? Seem to be quite most farmers seem to be quite opposed to that idea. Even if you would propose a better income to them, it's not something that they feel is a right thing to do. Do you agree with that observation? And how would you explain it?
Well, if there's one thing I've learned is the diversity of the farming community.
Yeah.
So yes, definitely there are farmers that are reluctant or would feel reluctant to move towards a more integrated, less intensive model. But what I also observe is that there are so many farmers that want to, but are so stuck in this kind of high productive, high capital system that it's really hard for them to imagine how to move forward. Also because of the psychological bandwidth. So they're so stuck in this system that we've all created together. More food, more production. We need to feed humanity. And this kind of assignment was given to a lot of farmers, and a lot of them took it very seriously. And we all went for it through investments and government policies. And now we're coming to realize that it's way too intensive and it's pushing the boundaries way too far. And now we need to shift. And now, so the whole public opinion is starting to shift towards, why do we have so many animals? And why are we working so intensively with pesticides and herbicides? And so our consciousness is shifting. But how do you actually move out of that system that we've all created? That's, I think, where a lot of the barriers come from. Also, that farmers, really don't know how. And are also not maybe supported in the most effective way in making that transition. And secondly, it's also an intergenerational thing again. So if your father did it this way and your grandfather did it in a certain way and you've been like taught this way, then it's really hard to shift those core beliefs. That takes time.
Change is hard for everyone.
Yeah.
I think like change is really, really hard. We're not wired for change as humans, right?
We don't like change.
We don't like it. It's really tough. So I can only imagine how hard it is to ask from someone to change something they've done their whole lives, that they've learned from their fathers and their grandfathers, that they've been told their whole lives by advisors, by society, that this is what they should be doing.
Yeah.
Then to ask of people like that now to change the way they do things, I mean, it's incredibly hard.
And also consumers then also need to change their behavior. So if we want farmers to work more sustainably, then buy more sustainably. I know not everybody can afford it, but then we need to create solidarity systems for this. So we need to work, we all need to make this move, It's not only the farmer's responsibility. So yes, I'm sure there are farming communities where they're absolutely reluctant, but I mostly see a lot of farmers that actually want to create change, but are so stuck they don't even know where to begin. So we all need to stand behind them or around them and create this kind of support system, including the whole value chain partners, all these big food and beverage companies, supermarkets, traders. They have so much power to help change the system towards a more localized one or a more balanced one. And so everybody needs to chip in.
I have just a really small favor to ask. If you're enjoying this conversation and you would like to support my work and this podcast, you can do that in just 5 seconds. Whichever platform you're using right now to listen to this, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or anywhere else, just click on the Deep Seed page and hit the follow or subscribe button. It really makes a big difference for me and for the podcast, so thank you so much in advance. Let's get back to it. So going back to the example of the Wij.Land project, mm-hmm. How does that work then? How do we enable the farmers to evolve their system in a way that benefits them first? And how do you bring in, you said, different actors, different stakeholders to support that vision?
So what I've seen with Wij.Land, their approach, but also in Spain and other countries that we work with partners, like I said, the kitchen table conversations, listening, and then also listening to where the energy is. So if a farmer indicates that he or she wants to know more about the soil. Let's start there. So it really starting with where the energy is. So if you're interested in maybe introducing some perennial crops, or perennial means multiple years rather than an annual crop. So perennial systems are really interesting to look into because they also have a great benefit for soil health in the long term. But that's a whole branch we can go into. But so if a farmer is interested in perennial crops or introducing like trees or nuts or fruit trees, then let's see if that's possible and try it out, So go where the energy is. I think that's a big lesson. Farmers are very, and this is a generalizing comment, but they really like action on the ground. They just really like seeing things with their own eyes, trying out things with their own hands or with their own equipment, trying out things on the land. They're just really common sense kind of people. Like, does this work? Could this work on my farm? So begin with just small experiments, sharing with other farmers. And farmers learn from other farmers. So let's minimize the external advice as much as possible and just let farmers exchange with other farmers and facilitate that.
Right, okay. Because I'm thinking ahead of the next step of the supply chain, for example.
Yeah.
I was talking to a farmer this morning where we visited a farm here in the Netherlands for a separate episode, and he was growing unusual crops like sorghum, for example, because it has great ecological benefits and it works really well in his system. But sort of mentioned that they need more farmers growing these crops so that they can, as a cooperative or something, gather them together and then sell them to retail. But do we see these efforts, or does Commonland contribute to talking to these big retail companies or processing companies to say, well, actually, the farmers, we've spoken to the farmers in the regions, they've told us, I mean, I'm making up the example here, right? But they've told us that actually they want to grow more sorghum because it's really good for their system. It works really well in their system. Yeah. And so they need more demand for it. Are you willing to start working on recipes, on marketing for products made from sorghum? Is that something that happens?
So this is a great example. So I feel like if this opportunity arises, let's imagine you have a community of farmers that want to produce differently and want to be ensured of offtake of their products. This is typically a great role for our local landscape partners that are situated in the landscape to feel into that. So, for example, Wij.Land also works with value chain partners. Alvalal similarly with maybe almond milk production companies, or Danone, for example, or all kinds of businesses that are also interested in buying more locally, buying more regeneratively. So we really encourage our partners and stimulate our partners to engage in those conversations. And where we can open doors, we will. But I think it's really landscape-led, you could say, these conversations. We do, however, in addition, try to create what we call spaces of belonging. So spaces where all these actors from the system can get together and have a coordinated conversation about what is happening in this region, both in terms of value chains, production, but also ecological boundaries, economic boundaries. How can we create a healthy system? So we're trying to create these spaces where people can interact and collaborate together with their partners, ideally at a landscape level, sometimes at a national level, to invite these system players into the room. Mm-hmm. So you want to have the whole system in the room, because otherwise it's going to be, just us agreeing on a lot of things, but not changing anything. You know what I mean? Yeah. So sometimes it needs to, be a bit scary to disagree and then see how can we find a common ground. So a lot of 3D modeling of understanding the system, literally with some clay and little puppets and a little animal. So you're trying to recreate the system on a table. So you put people around a table. That's also one of the Theory U methods, to let the system see itself.
So is the TOAU method or
Theory U, as in the U?
Theory U.
The letter U. Theory U.
Theory U. Yeah, you mentioned it earlier, and I didn't want to interrupt, but I wasn't sure what you mentioned. Yeah. Okay, Theory U.
So it's a methodology to work in complex multi-stakeholder settings in a meaningful way, based on more awareness, more conscious understanding of the system. And they've developed a lot of methodologies and tools to be able to facilitate that. So a lot of our work is supporting our partners in facilitating these multi-stakeholder spaces. That's actually, if you dumb down our work, that's a lot of what we do, trying to create these collaborative spaces with multiple stakeholders to discuss the complexity of the landscape.
Okay, bringing people together
Yeah.
so they can really have a discussion and understand each other better and understand what they could do for each other and maybe create some synergies that could lead to real change.
And often our partners like organize those conversations, but we help whenever we can, and we have a lot of great facilitation experience. So
Great, yeah. This is a subject I would really like to discuss with you. I think that's something that you've worked on a lot, and I think you mentioned it earlier actually, is the human versus wildlife conflict situations.
Yes.
Could you maybe give us some examples, the common examples of those kind of conflicts and how you work to resolve them?
So back in the day when I was still a student, I did research on a human-wildlife conflict in the south of Kenya. Of course, that's it's a more an example far away from home, because we're talking about lions, hyenas, elephants that are not really common in Europe. So for me, there was a big shift, even though my father's been active in conservation for a long time. So the problem there, as an example, was that you had a national park where all these wild animals can freely live without boundaries. So the animals can get in and out of the park freely. But you also have Maasai communities living around the park, which is their ancient ancestral lands. And they have cows and sheep and goats. And so they're, of course, a nomadic tribe, and they herd animals. And so at night, these lions could go out of the park and then attack their cattle. And so that would be a human-wildlife conflict. They can also attack people, of course, sometimes. And the conflict arose around how do you compensate for the value that's being lost? Because the cattle is basically the bank account of the community. And the national park management wants these tourists to keep coming, but the local community around the park doesn't really see the benefits of it economically. So they mostly see wild animals eating their cattle and them losing a lot of their income. And so they've been experimenting with a compensation scheme. So you would get, when your cow, for example, was killed by a lion, you would get compensated for the amount of the value worth of the cow. And then in return, the question to community would be, can you refrain from killing the lion? Because traditionally in the Maasai community, lion killing was part of becoming a man. So the warrior, becoming a warrior in the community. And so it's also about culture change, and also about valuing local community and their traditions while allowing them to benefit from these tourists that keep coming. So I was trying to understand the perspective of the local community as to why they were killing the lions, not just from a traditional practice, but also as a kind of political protest. So if the park management doesn't listen to us, then we'll kill these wild animals to get their attention, right? That was kind of the conflict they were in. And in the end, the compensation scheme worked really well, but it does require a lot of time and conversation to create this culture change and value the local community, and the local community in return respects the animals. And they have this deep cultural respect from their own culture already for the way they respected the lion was amazing, but it was also part of their culture to kill the lion and become a warrior. So I was like trying to understand that conflict. Now in the Netherlands, just going back here, we have the wolf coming back naturally. And there's a lot of conflict arising with sheep farmers that are really struggling, because we also see a lot of wild dogs, or dogs not being trained well. Let's put it that way. We don't have a lot of wild dogs in the Netherlands, but dogs not being trained well, killing sheep. But also the wolf is killing sheep. And so now we're mixing that all up in one big bowl of anger. And so sheep farmers need to be supported in protecting their animals. Either through subsidies or funding or compensation. And we need to culturally get used to the fact that there are big, large mammals like wolves coming back that are affecting our ecosystems in a positive way, but also in a very crowded country with a lot of infrastructure, cars, houses, cities, towns. So it's fascinating to observe how it also polarizes the discussion. You're either for or against, There's no middle ground, kind of.
Difficult conversations to have, right?
And actually, we're expanding our home as humans and our presence on Earth, but these animals were there before we came, So how do we respect each other's houses?
Yeah. And the case of the wolf is creating a lot of debate in Europe at the moment. What are the benefits of wolves in natural ecosystems in?
There's this famous story about how wolves change rivers. It's a very famous story. If you go to YouTube and look it up, how wolves change rivers, it's an amazing story of how in science it's called the trophic cascade. So if the wolf comes back, the behavior of the grazing animals like deer or starts to change. So they start to graze differently. Their grazing patterns change. So in the Yellowstone National Park in America, they reintroduced wolves. The animal behavior of the grazers changed, thereby allowing, especially during at the waterways, the river sides, because they didn't want to be like openly vulnerable to the wolves. So then the little trees and the shrubs, they had some time to actually grow without being eaten by the deer. That then changed or brought a more favorable habitat for the beaver. That then changed the water flow. So you have all these kinds of effects ecologically because of the reintroduction of a keystone species. And in the Netherlands, even what I've observed in a documentary that was made on this is when pine trees that are falling over all across Europe now because of the climate change, the deer are less likely to graze in between these fallen trees because they don't have a sight line. They can't see properly. And because the wolf is now here, they want to see properly. So they don't graze in between these fallen trees. And then these small baby trees have actually some time to grow. So you have loaf trees or broadleaf trees now actually regrowing in the Netherlands. So it's already having an ecological effect next to a highly social conflict effect. But I'd be curious to see how this changes over time.
But the social conflict effect is one that in the case of that Maasai community could be resolved with money, with compensation
and respect,
and respect. In the case here of the wolf, wouldn't be kind of the same thing. We know now that this kind of restoration has value, and that the wolf alone, without us needing to do anything, is contributing to massive restoration that has a lot of economic value. Could we not decide to then have a budget aside to compensate farmers or people who suffer losses?
That's it. Yeah. So the beavers and wolves and all these animals, they do work for us. They create healthy ecosystems that we benefit from. So I think our national budget should include allowing for these animals to live here and then compensating for any damage that comes with it. Of course, it needs to be managed in a way, and you have a European protocol for how you deal with wolves that become tame or dangerous, and you need to take that very seriously because otherwise the public support will go down massively. So of course you need some kind of management system. If a wolf becomes dangerous, you need to take measures. So I'm fully for that. And at the same time, can we readjust our policies and procedures and management techniques to allow for this while having a public debate and creating cultural change around the fact that, if you walk around the national park here, there are wolves. And even for me, like when I walk around now, it's like, so it's like, and I also recognize their feces now. And so it's like, okay, so there are wolves here. And it takes time to get used to that again.
Yeah. I understand that.
That takes time and conversations, public debate. Yeah.
What's your role at Commonland?
Good question that I often ask myself as well. No, what's my role at Commonland? So it started working in the knowledge exchange and learning. So creating these opportunities for landscapes to learn from each other through community of practice sessions, through learning weeks. And then I transitioned into a landscape development role, which I've done for the last 3.5 years to support landscape restoration on the ground, in the Netherlands mainly. And so that means providing direct support to landscape partners on their strategy, their funding procedures, their approach, making connections, opening doors for them, whatever they needed, I would be there. And also think along, how do you mobilize people in your landscape? How do you mobilize farmers? So just thinking along, basically. And as of this week, I've started a new role within Commonland, focusing more on providing these many-to-many kind of learning opportunities. So for many landscapes to learn from many other landscapes. So I'm basically back to where I started, but in a more advanced way, because we're really taking that very seriously to create these learning opportunities for people to, take up the work more.
It's very exciting. I mean, it must be amazing to wake up every day and think that I'm going to contribute to, wide scale ecosystem restoration, bringing people together, rebuilding communities. I mean, it's amazing.
It feels very purposeful. And of course, I have days where I spend mostly time behind my laptop and figuring out things. So it's always trying to find the balance between making the work possible by creating conditions behind your laptop and making connections, and going into the field and really sensing into why are we actually doing this. So but it's amazing. It feels really good. Yeah.
How big is Commonland? How many people are working there, and how how many projects are you involved in around the world?
So we're now, I think, a little over 10 years old. So we're relatively young. We have grown to almost 40 people, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even more. So we've really grown massively. When I started, there were 5-6 people.
And that's the core team really working for Commonland, not including, of course, the huge number of different stakeholders.
So that's just the core team of Commonland. And then we work with at least 50 to 100 different partners all over the world that do amazing things on the ground. And so it's like an extended family vibe a little bit.
So you started by talking about the 4 returns. How would you sort of assess Commonland on these 4 returns?
Ooh, good one. So let's start with what's most important. I think the hope and inspiration. I think our founder is a very spiritual and hopeful man, and also very optimistic, even though he's also a realist, like myself. So to me, he's really inspiring, and that DNA of looking beyond the obvious. Doggy. Doggy, what are you doing?
You're like, okay, I'm tired now. Let's
done. This is too much talking.
Okay. 10 more minutes, boo boo, and then we go. Okay? Yes, be a good boy. Okay.
Cutie.
No.
Uh-oh.
Boo boo. Ginzo.
Okay, you can come and sit here.
Here. Come here. Yes. Okay.
So I would start with the hope and inspiration. So I feel like, at least in our culture as an organization, we're trying to spend time on reflecting, learning, connecting with ourselves and each other. So I think also everyone in the organization has their own journey. Some people are religious, some are not. Some are more science oriented. Some are more spiritual. And I think we're always trying to create spaces for these deeper connections and deeper conversations. So building in time to be still, even though the work is crazy and we make ourselves crazy. But I think in our internal culture, this is really part of what we're trying to do.
Oh yeah, so when you're talking about inspiration, it's both inwards, but within the company and the people working there, create inspiration for people working there, but also outwards, so creating inspiration for people outside.
So of course you want to be inspired, but you also can inspire yourself in a way, which sounds a bit weird, but it also connects to this theory youth story I was telling, about if you're disconnected from yourself, how the hell are you going to connect to others and to a place? And it seems so logical when you say it now, but we're in a society where it's highly individualistic. we're not used to sharing our deepest desires and thoughts and wishes. We kind of reserve that for the people that are closest to us rather than a wider community. So how can we create these spaces of belonging also in organizations, not just in the landscape, but also in organizations, so that we feel like our cup is filled rather than emptying? And I'm not saying we're perfect at all. We're working on it, but it's definitely on our radar. If we talk about hope and inspiration, we definitely need to do that also for ourselves. And hopefully that will spill over to our partners that also sense and feel this, and also feel like we can help create space for them to reflect. So with Wij.Land, for example, I've tried to support them in creating spaces for reflection. So I would join their team days to kind of create a little bit of space to breathe and calm down a little bit and step out of the daily grind. So I hope and I think that we score well on the return of inspiration, although it's a constant nurturing process.
Do you actually have a score? Do you assess yourself, or how does that work?
Well, we have a monitoring and evaluation system, and also in evaluating, we're actually in the middle of an external evaluation, evaluating our own role vis-a-vis our partners. Have we been supporting them in the right way? Have we hampered their own work in unintendedly? So we're trying to evaluate our own effectiveness together with our partners to see, have we created change on the ground together with partners or not? Probably yes, but maybe in some cases not. And we're trying to be vulnerable, humble from a place of not knowing. I think the last 10 years, we've also made ourselves, we've been punching above our weight, you could say. So I think now, after 10 years of proving that we're worthwhile and we're staying around here, I think we can also take some moments to like reflect and feel like, okay, we've proven that we're valuable and we have a place in this world. And maybe now we can also breathe a little bit and keep going, of course, and scale up our work. But in terms of, I think we're financially healthy. We have an amazing fundraising team, also supporting our landscape partners in fundraising. I think in the natural capital or the natural return, so to say, that is mostly effectuated through the work of our partners. We're situated in the north of Amsterdam in a more industrial site. So I think we could, in the future, maybe move our office more to the ground on a farm. That could be improved. In terms of the social values, our whole work is tied together through relationships. So that's all we do all day. If you ask me, what do you do all day? Build relationships, nurture relationships, make connections all day long. So I hope that we score well there. If not, then we're not treating our most valuable asset right.
I probably have so many other questions I can talk to you about biodiversity, there's so many things. Unfortunately, there's only so many hours in the day and so many minutes in every hour. And we're going to have to close this conversation, but it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to talk to you. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. Super nice.
Take care.